And
My name is Dave Bell with Cyber Solutions, and today what we're going to talk about is cybersecurity, in particular the 12 pillars of prevention. And when we first started this session and created this presentation, maybe 3-4 years ago, it started with 7 pillars, it advanced to 10, and now we're at 12. So it's definitely expanding and changing and evolving as we go. So we'll start with 12 here. If you attend next year, it might be at 15, but at this point, we're going to start with 12. So the agenda today, we're going to look at the landscape of security and how things are changing, how hackers are attempting to separate you from your money is really what this is all about. So we'll look at that landscape, and then we'll look at the 12 pillars. And each individual pillar, 1 through 12, we'll take a look at each one and how you can help protect your business from these hackers. And then I'll open up for question and answer at the end of the session. So this first slide talks about the security landscape, and you can see all of the different headlines that are up there. And you see the Sonys, the Home Depots, the Targets of the world. Those are the published hacks and breaches that happen annually. But what you don't see is the small and mid-sized business breaches that happen. Those are obviously much less publicized, but those are the most common. We, as small and mid-sized business owners, we may think that we are immune to these types of attacks, but quite frankly, hackers see us as the low-hanging fruit. It is much more difficult, or traditionally has been much more difficult to get into the Targets, the Home Depots. Those are huge scores, if you will, for a hacker. But if you look at the small and mid-sized business, and we'll look at a couple threats that hackers are using, they are the low-hanging fruit because we've traditionally thought we were immune to those types of attacks and maybe haven't implemented the proper security to protect ourselves. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Again, these are the headlines that happen every day, but they focus on the larger businesses rather than businesses like ours. So the security landscape, a couple of different attack types. And the first one, we're going to look at a slide here, a little a demonstration, or not demonstration, but a slide here. The first one is firewall penetration. And this is where a hacker will try and knock on your front door and find security vulnerabilities to get in. The next one is a Trojan horse strategy. We'll get into that in just a moment. And then what we see is the landscape is going to be more about ransomware. Ransomware, as you can see by the slide here, was estimated by the FBI to be a $1 billion industry in 2016. In 2017 and now in 2018, it's increased dramatically. And this number is probably even conservative because there are a lot of businesses that are infected with ransomware, pay the dollar amount, and then don't report it. So what the FBI is doing some level of estimation when they come up with this number, and I'm guessing it's quite a bit low, very conservative. But here's the first attack that you might face, and that's the firewall penetration. And you can see in this slide that there are 2 hackers. The top one is doing what we call a brute force attack. And what he's doing is typing in, he's knocking on your front door and trying to guess, if you will, a username and password that's going to work that will connect him into your network. And you can see he's kind of sitting there, and the graphic that I use there shows like he's typing the username and password. And that's not true. He's not typing in user 1 and then password 1 and user 2, password 2, and trying all the different combinations. He has an automated tool that he just sets it up where he wants to point to, whose firewall he wants to attack, basically pushes the go button, and then walks away and may come back a day, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, and it has automatically tried multiple combinations of username and password to try and get a hit. And if he does get a hit, of course, then that logs it so that the hacker can quickly go back and attempt to breach that firewall with the username and password that was discovered. So that's one. The second guy down below, he's looking for firewall vulnerabilities, basically holes in your firewall. And if you don't keep your firewall patched, vulnerabilities definitely come up. They're being discovered on what seems like a daily basis. And if he is, and again, he's not manually looking for these vulnerabilities, he has a utility or a tool that he just clicks go on, and it'll scan not only your firewall, but an entire list of IP addresses that he's entered. So it will go and scan one at a time and look for vulnerabilities, and then if it finds some, again, it'll log that vulnerability, and he can come back a day or two or a week later and look at that log and see where he can maybe do some further damage and breach further. So that's what the firewall penetration looks like. And again, if we look at this slide, we can see, I've got to kind of set this up. There is a network there on the right-hand side with some happy computers and a server and then a firewall. And these two hackers are outside of that network trying to gain access, okay? That is in contrast to the next slide, where a hacker might use a Trojan horse strategy. And this is a strategy that you might be more familiar with. And that what they do is, you can see by the slide there, is they craft an email that they send in, and of course the firewall sees the email and knows that we're accepting email, so it'll allow that inside. And then if I open that email, depending on what's inside, I might become infected, my machine might become infected. But it's a way for a hacker to get in to the network, and then we'll see what happens once he's inside here in just a moment. But let's talk about that email for a moment and how that's evolved. In the past, you might remember, emails that you've gotten might be from some prince overseas looking to give you money. They're just very obvious attempts at scamming you. And they had poor grammar, poor spelling, and it was very easy to identify a scam or a spam email that came through. That has changed. And you can see by some of the examples I've got up here, the first one being FedEx. We kind of evaluate this email. But again, these emails are composed to trick you into clicking something or doing something. And here in the FedEx case, they've stolen the logo, so the email looks very legitimate. The grammar and the spelling is correct, and it goes on to say, unfortunately, we tried to deliver you something, you weren't home, or whatever the case may be, and click here to see what you missed out on. And they prey on your emotions. That's where they try and get you. And if you click on this link, the link happens to print a shipping label, you'll be brought to a website that will likely attempt to infect your machine. One very quick way to identify whether this is a scam or not is to hover over the link that they want you to click on. So in this case, that print a shipping label, if we hover over that, it'll pop up, or a bubble will pop up and tell us where we are going to be led to if we click on it. And a lot of times it's not FedEx.com, it might be a hacker's site. So that's one, it's not 100% bulletproof, but it is one way to see if you're going to be redirected to a different site. So that's the FedEx example there. The next one, of course, is ADP. Again, they stole the logo, they've given you some, oh, we found some activity on your account that looks suspicious, some sort of verbiage like that, and then there's a link that you can click on. Again, they're trying to prey on your emotions. So if you click on that, you'll likely be redirected to a site that's going to attempt to infect you. So that is the second one. The third one is resumes. So if you are accepting resumes via email, and there are hackers that will attempt to send you an infected resume file, you are expecting a resume because you might be hiring, and so you open that, and all of a sudden your machine is infected. So it might be best to use a hiring service or a website that specializes in hiring. And of course, I can't think of any that come to mind at the moment, but Indeed, I guess, is one. Kind of a hiring site where there's a central spot where people can upload their resumes and not send them to you directly, and then you look at the resume online rather than opening it as an attachment. The other, I like to share this example. I had a client who once forwarded me an email that said, Dave, check this out, someone's trying to scam me. And again, keeping in mind that these hackers try to prey on your emotions, the email said, and I'm going to paraphrase quite a bit, but it went on to say, the subject line said, your life is in danger, in all capital letters. And then down below, it started to go in the body of the email, it started to talk about how this this guy was an assassin, well-trained, has been an assassination around the world for decades, and on and on and on. And basically saying your life, there's been a contract taken out on, in this case, my client's life, and unless he contacts this assassin and pays him a certain dollar amount, then unfortunately the assassin is going to have to follow through on this attempt on his life, and it preyed on his emotion. And of course, my client didn't believe there was no truth to this, and most people are going to say that's obviously a scam. But all that person really needs is one person to respond, and it's going to make it worthwhile. It takes zero cost or very little cost to send out millions of emails to people, but if you can just hook in one or two people, it's easily going to pay for itself. So, but yeah, those are examples of Trojan horse phishing emails that you want to be careful of. They look very legitimate these days. So another way that you can become infected is, we just talked about a phishing email or a Trojan horse. Another way is what we call malvertising. And in this slide, what we see is a common website, and you've probably been to websites that have this same concept. Along the right-hand side, there's a display of ads that are constantly changing. So when you visit a site, you might be there to read some sort of content, but right on one of the borders, there's going to be some advertising content that maybe keeps changing. And the website owners they basically lease out that space of their website to advertising agencies that will cycle those through. So the website owner gets paid to have these advertisements that keep cycling through. Well, if that advertising agency is not analyzing or managing those ads and trying to prevent them from being infected, you might end up with an ad that pops in that will look to infect your machine. Let me give you an example, and some of you might remember this. It's been probably 2+ years ago that the Star Tribune had a breach just like this. So, very common site, especially here in the Twin Cities. If you went to the Star Tribune website and you visited their main website, their main page, that advertising was going through. They had an infected ad that was populating through. And users or visitors that went to that site and saw that ad, if their machine wasn't properly protected, they were infected by what we call a drive-by infection. They just went to a website, that ad was malicious, and it tried to infect or inject their machine with malware. So we have to be very careful on the sites that we visit. So that's another way, malvertising, in addition to the Trojan horse emails. Okay, so let's pretend for a moment that a hacker was successful in getting into your network. And I've displayed that sort of here in this graphic, and again, I'll go back to this slide quite a few times during this presentation, but on the right-hand side, we have what used to be a healthy network, protected by a firewall and the World Wide Web there. But now we can see that there's a sick computer down in the lower right-hand corner. And you can see about a little note there I made that he's now contracted what we call an exploit kit. And that's either through an email or a drive-by infection. But now he's sick. And I make it very obvious in this slide that bottom computer is sick. But in a hacker's world, he wants that sickness to be very not noticeable, so very stealthy. So you're going to look at this and maybe see that all three machines are healthy. But in my example, I wanted to just point out that this one's infected. So now he has an exploit kit installed on that computer. And the first thing that exploit kit will do is, based on my first bullet there, is phone home to set up command and control. And if you follow the red arrows on this, you can see that he's phoning home to that top hacker's website, and what they're doing is setting up command and control. Once that exploit kit is installed and it's phoned home, the hacker has complete control over your PC. And there are certain things that he'll do. The two most common are, number one, to install a keylogger, and that is exactly what it sounds like. Every keystroke that you type is going to be tracked and sent back to the hacker. And if you think about that for a moment, a very common thing that you might do is banking, whether it's for your business or for for your personal bank account. But you go open up a web browser and you might type wellsfargo.com or usbank.com or whatever it happens to be. And then of course the next thing that you do is likely type in your username and password. All of those keystrokes are captured and sent up to the hacker, who then can, of course, evaluate. It's probably, if I go to US Bank, that's a red flag that I'm going to go to my banking site, and then he'll capture my username and password. And then he can utilize that. Now, of course, banks do use multi-factor authentication, but, and so the hacker hasn't captured that yet, but they do have one half. They basically have where you're banking, and they also have your username and password. So now they just need that last factor and some way to circumvent that, and all of a sudden they have full access to your banking information. So keyloggers is one thing that the hacker might install once he has control of your machine. The other thing which you've probably heard of is ransomware. And ransomware is a piece of software that when you install it, it looks on all of your drives on your machine and all of your network shares that you might have on your machine, and then encrypts all of the documents and data on those folders and on those drives, and then takes the key to unlock that encryption and sends it up to the hacker. And then the hacker basically holds it for ransom and says, I will give you this key if you pay me a certain amount of money. And this is very, very common. You've probably heard this. Maybe it's even happened to you. There are multiple ways that you can fix this, but you have to roll back to a backup and do a restore, because in today's world with the newest variants of this ransomware, there is no way to unlock that data without paying the money. So we've either got to pay it or we've got to restore somehow. In that third bullet there, in larger environments, if a hacker has installed an exploit kit, instead of doing a keylogger or ransomware, he might do some recon or network enumeration. Like in the case of Target or Home Depot. The Target breach they got in, rather than immediately trying to gain some benefit or some dollars or that they knew they were in Target, so they started to do some recon around the Target systems to see if there were other vulnerabilities that they could take advantage of. And in fact, they did find that, and they found a whole bunch of customer records. So the rest is history, I guess. But so that's what the third bullet there is. What they might do is do some recon. If they realize this might be a big client or a big breach, they'll try and stay stealthy and just do some recon work to see where else they can exploit. Okay, so I'm going to back up the slide again. So keep in mind that exploit kit there. That installed exploit kit, which is very stealthy. You may not even know it's there, likely don't even know it's there unless you have the proper protections in place. And let's take a look at what I like to call the cybercrime Craigslist. And what you can see here, it's in Russian, but we've translated here. Greetings to all. Due to overstock, I'm selling unneeded installs. And those installs he's referring to are those exploit kits. So he's got, basically for $60, he will provide you with 1,000 installs of those exploit kits. So in other words, I pony up $60, I now control 60 PCs out there, and I can do whatever I want with them. So paying in advance with no escrow, there are some more details about it. Delivery here down below, it says you pay and I start running your executable in 10 minutes. In other words, I pony up $60, I control 1,000 of these exploit kits. In 10 minutes, he'll do whatever I want, ask him to do, whether it's a keylogger, ransomware, or I can install some things. One of the scarier things is, once they have full control, if you have a webcam, they can turn that on and watch what you're doing without you knowing it. And so, once they have that exploit kit installed, there's nothing really that they can't do. So, in 10 minutes, if you have an infection or an exploit kit installed, you could be being monitored, you could have a keylogger installed or ransomware installed. It goes on to state that a quality statement. So if you inquire with others who have already purchased installs, sort of this referral-based kind of community here. So it's a very interesting, what I call the cybercrime Craigslist. And if we bounce to the next page here, you can see that in different countries, This is the price per 1,000 infections. And if we focus on the US there, $70 or 7 cents an install. Pardon. Excuse me. So if you install, if you want 1,000 installs, you can pay 7 cents a piece, which is incredibly inexpensive to grab control of 1,000 different machines. So, all right, so that's sort of an awareness part of the, it's not meant to scare you, it's meant to raise some awareness on what threats are out there. And then what we believe in is defense in depth or layers of protection. So we want to talk about the 12 pillars of prevention next. And here they're listed, and we'll start from the top and just work our way down. We'll get into more detail in some than others, but these are the 12 pillars that we would recommend that you use to protect yourself from some of these attacks that are out there. It's important to say that nothing is 100% bulletproof, but we try and do what we can to protect ourselves from these hackers. We've had very good luck with these 12 pillars. Pillar number 1 is patching and updates. And as the bullet says up there, 90%, it's estimated that 90% of infections could be prevented if certain applications were patched. In this case, Windows and Office. Windows includes Internet Explorer as well as part of that package. So if you are keeping your machines, your Windows machines patched, current, all the critical updates that Microsoft releases, that would include for Office, Windows, and Internet Explorer, then 90% of infections could be prevented. Think about that. If Internet Explorer is a browser that a lot of people use, if you went to the Star Tribune website a couple years ago, as I mentioned, if your browser wasn't patched properly, that infection would have been successful. But if you had patched it to the most current level, it would not have been successful, and it wouldn't have been able to reach or infect your machine. So 90% of infections could be prevented by making sure Windows, Office, and Internet Explorer are patched. You could do that an automated way. Windows allows you to go in and set up automatic updates. In fact, they're in Windows 10, they're set up automatically. But but you want to make sure you check on that. That auto update feature is notorious for failing, and we want to make sure it's running constantly. Otherwise, we're going to get behind on updates, and we're going to end up with a problem. The two biggest, according to the FBI, the two most vulnerable applications on the planet are Adobe and Java. Adobe, because everybody uses PDFs, and they're floating around the internet on a regular basis. And Java, because a lot of websites use Java. And of course, we visit a lot of websites, and then we have to have Java enabled for that to function. There is a utility called Ninite Pro that if you've got more than a couple of machines, it might make sense to subscribe to Ninite Pro. It allows you to manage updates across just a whole bunch of applications. So you can see by the slide here, our network is listed on the left, and then on the right is a list of all applications, and then we can configure it to update those applications so that we're patched on all of our apps. So for pillar 1, just give some quick takeaways. Do not set it and forget it. You're going to hear me say that throughout this presentation, is that you can't, a lot of the stuff, and I'd say all of it, you can't just set it and forget it. You've got to monitor it and make sure that things are happening the way you intend them, especially on automatic updates. Those can fail regularly. Use the built-in Windows updates, but then, again, just make sure you're checking it. You can also use Ninite Pro for third-party apps. Pillar 2, advanced endpoint security, which is a fancy way of saying antivirus software. Many, many years ago, when I first started in this industry, you could take a single piece of antivirus software and install it on your machine, and you'll be protected. That is not the case anymore. What we need to do is, as I've been talking all along, is different pillars of defense or layers of defense. So I want to skip that first bullet there, signature-based versus cloud-based, but skip to the second one. Don't forget about mobile devices. It's shocking to me that there aren't more attacks on mobile devices. We have, in almost all of the sessions that I present this presentation to, just about everybody has a smartphone. And we use those things for what? Email, calendar, banking information maybe, social media, are in, a lot of times a big part of our lives are in our phones. And there aren't a lot of people talking about mobile protection through antivirus software, what have you. So the one that we use for mobile devices is called WebRoot, and it's relatively, I think it's free for home users. I've got it on my phone, and it just sits in the background and looks at applications that I download and looks for different things that happen, and it warns me if something is malicious. So WebRoot, both iOS devices and Android devices are protected with WebRoot. I'm sure there are others like Trend Micro, Norton, and some others that provide mobile antivirus software as well. I would highly encourage you to get one. Cloud-based malware protection versus content filtering. So the reason we call it advanced endpoint security is because it doesn't just scan for viruses. There are some other features that it does for us. And that's that third bullet. And we're going to talk about each of those individually. Cloud-based malware protection, and then content filtering. So the first thing I want to do is spend just a couple of minutes here explaining what DNS is, because it's somewhat important to this discussion so that you understand what DNS, what its function is on the internet, and how hackers take advantage of that versus what we can do to protect ourselves. So first of all, we'll look at what is DNS. Then once we understand that, again, it's a very quick couple of minutes. And then once we understand that, we can look at cloud-based malware protection, how controlling that DNS allows us to prevent cloud-based malware, and then content filtering. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So what is DNS? Very quickly. So every single, every single server or service on the internet has a numeric IP assigned to it. So you've probably heard us IT geeks talk about 1.3.4, whatever it happens to be. We are constantly talking in numeric IPs. But when normal people, and anyone that opens up a web browser, when you go to a website, ESPN.com, MSN.com, whatever it happens to be, you don't want to remember the numerical IP address. You want to just type in the friendly name that you remember. So here's an example, a little self-promotion as well. www.cybersolutions-web.com is our website. That is unrecognized by a web browser until it's translated to a numeric IP address. So if I go ahead and key in that address, and it doesn't, as you can see by the little diagram there, it doesn't know where to go. So the service that helps it decide and translate that friendly name into an IP address is called DNS. And you can see in step 2, the DNS resolves the web address to an IP address, gives that IP address back to the web browser, and then the browser is able to go to the proper website. So think of, in its very simplest terms, DNS is really a database of 2 columns. The first column is the friendly name, the cybersolutions-web.com, the ESPN, the MSN, all of those friendly names down one column. And then on the other column is the corresponding numeric IP address. And DNS's job, that the only thing it needs to do is go down that list, find the friendly name, and translate to an IP, and then send it back up, and that's all it does. There are some additional functions that go along with it, but that's the basis of it. Okay? So the problem lies in this DNS. This is a public service. DNS is a public service, and that means I can control it, hackers can control it. If you have your control of your domain, you can control what you put into DNS. So let's think about that for a moment. We're going to go back to that slide that we saw a little bit earlier with the network and the sick computer that's phoning home. And if we follow those red arrows, the infected machine goes through the firewall, out to the World Wide Web, and then back to the computer, the hackers. That's the phone home piece. That piece is dependent on the public DNS service. But if we can remove that, and instead of using the public DNS, use a private DNS service, and there are several that are out there, we can quickly stop that phoning home from happening. And just a very quick bit of technical information, the way that happens is Cisco, as an example. Cisco maintains a private DNS. And what they will do is they scan all services on the internet, and they collect all the data, all the traffic patterns on those different servers, and they can tell by analytics that they have which servers are very, very likely hacker servers. And then they can blacklist those. You know, if a certain website exhibits certain characteristics, they can tell very quickly that it's a hacker website, and they'll put it on the blacklist. Then, since we control, and by we I mean Cisco, but we subscribe to Cisco's private DNS, if we know that it's a blacklisted website, we can block it, as indicated by the slide there. So the exploit kit tries to phone home, uses the Cisco, and in the example I'm giving, uses the Cisco DNS. Cisco knows the site is bad, so it will block that from happening. We haven't prevented the exploit kit from being installed, but we have prevented that exploit kit from phoning home, which means the hacker never knows it's infected, and he can't control that exploit kit. So in that scenario, it's all about containment. The user's been infected, the machine's been infected. We can't prevent that. That's already happened. That's after the fact. But we can prevent it from phoning home, which means it can't get ransomware. It can't get keyloggers. It stops keyloggers from uploading data, meaning the ransomware's unlocking key can't be uploaded. So the bottom bullet there is the key. We've stopped it. We've contained it. But now we're going to get alerted, and we would respond to that and clean that up. Quite frankly, cleaning up a ransomware attack, knock on wood, at least in today's world, is fairly easy to clean up. It's the results of the attack that are a little bit harder. We've got to either restore or pay the ransom. Those are really our only two options. Okay, so let's take that a step further. If we can control DNS through Cisco or whatever partner we've decided, we can also do content filtering. So here's our little slide, little abbreviated slide. If our user tries to go to socialmedia.com or inappropriate.com or infected.com, we can control and prevent them from doing that. We have some clients that are very restrictive. You can't go to Facebook, you can't go to ESPN or any of these social or sports sites, and also different categories. They can't go to terrorist or violent or guns or different sites that are really not work related, and so they'll restrict those users from going to those sites. I always like to say I get a report weekly of all of our clients' users and where they're visiting, and almost always the #1 site is Facebook, unless it's March Madness, and then it's the sports sites. So there's definitely some inefficient time that's happening. Some clients prefer to let their employees be responsible for that. Others will take it into their own hands and prevent that from happening. But with the control of that DNS server, we do have the ability to block where our users will go. We call it content filtering. Some takeaways from Pillar 2. Webroot.com is the antivirus or the advanced endpoints security that we use. OpenDNS is the Cisco private DNS, and you may want to take a look at that. There are costs wrapped around both of these, but they're very, very good. The third pillar is spam filtering. Spam filtering is an easy way, email is a very easy way to introduce spam into the network or introduce an infection, malware. With spam filtering, we can remove viruses, malware, phishing, and more. Hosted versus installed, that's what I want to really talk about. If we look at an installed version of a spam filter, that is, we bought a Norton or we bought some third-party spam filtering software, we install it on our machine, and then it scans our Outlook or whatever email client we're using. It looks for any spam that might come in and then blacklists it. And some of those are very, very good. Others, maybe not so much. What we prefer is a hosted version. Rather than installing it locally and doing all of the processing and detection at that level, we do it before it even hits the network. My favorite example is we have a client that gets about 10 million emails per year. And of those 10 million, it's always in the 90 to 95% that are spam. So 9 million to 9.5 million are spam email. So if we didn't have a hosted solution, all of those emails would come into the network. You can see here, instead of that filter in the middle of this slide, all those emails would come in and the processing would happen within the network. So instead of that, we provide this filter out front of the firewall. This third party scrubs the email and then sends only what it has deemed acceptable into the network, which then cuts over 90% in this case. 90% of the emails get stripped off and the others get sent through, only the legitimate ones. So hosted is a much better option. So that's a quick pillar, but the takeaways are that if you are using the built-in spam filtering of Outlook, it isn't very good, and you'll need to supplement with something else. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly blacklisting stuff, and then it just slows down the performance of your Outlook. Consider additional cleaning through a third party. In my opinion, I would suggest hosted, but it's going to depend on your email client that you're using. If you're using Office 365, the hosted email filtering is very, very good. The spam filtering in Office 365 is very, very good. Firewall protection. I won't spend a ton of time on this pillar because I think firewalls are just very common these days. If you don't have one, you definitely need to get one, but I will give you a couple suggestions here. So the idea of the firewall, based on this slide, is to stop hackers from the outside world from getting in. And we want to keep them patched. And there are different subscriptions that you can get to your firewall. The two most common in the small to mid-sized business space are SonicWall, which is owned by Dell, and WatchGuard fireboxes. We're a WatchGuard partner, but SonicWall is just as good. Those are the two key ones. There are a couple other players that are coming into the market. They typically were enterprise players at one point, but they're dipping down into our space. But the most common SMB firewalls are WatchGuard and SonicWall. So as I started to mention there in Pillar 4, some takeaways: invest in a business class firewall. Don't go to Best Buy and get a Netgear or a Linksys or a firewall that's intended for a consumer environment. Make sure you're investing in a business class firewall. Again, the WatchGuards, the SonicWalls. There are definitely others, but just make sure they're not the consumer class. Include a unified threat management subscription. Usually this is pretty inexpensive, maybe $100 or a couple $100 a year. And it allows that firewall to do intrusion detection, some additional spam filtering, and some other features that come along with that. It's a small price to pay for an additional layer of protection. That bottom bullet there, start with deny all. That's the way the SonicWall and the Firebox work, is they don't try and guess what you want to have open. They just block all of it, or most all of it, and then you go in and open up only what you need. So, Pillar 5, relatively new pillar, the shadow IT. And this is becoming more and more of a problem, but let's just kind of describe it here. So in this slide, we have on the right-hand side a little bit different variation of the network, right? So we have a server with a file share. It has Excel, Word, PowerPoint documents there, and all three of our users are accessing and sharing those. And then there's a firewall that sits out front of them between them and the internet. And what a lot of users are doing these days is opening up a Dropbox account. And anybody can do that. They're inexpensive, and I think for a certain level they're free if you only need a small amount of data. But they install it on their machine in the office, and then they copy documents from the file share onto the Dropbox account, and then they can access it when they go home. And I completely understand why they want to do that. There's definitely a convenience factor there. The problem is, from an IT perspective, we're taking documents outside of our centralized management. So now this guy in the lower, the section with the headset there, if he's pulled out some PowerPoints and put it into his Dropbox account, what happens if he gets fired? And maybe it's not a good party. And now how are we going to control that personal Dropbox that he has? So that becomes a challenge for IT. Now he has some confidential data potentially out on his Dropbox. He's been fired, he's been let go, and we don't have any access to that Dropbox account to delete that data. We're going to trust that he does it. And whether he does or not, I guess we just want to make control of it. So I'm not saying that we don't want to do file syncing or file sharing services. Dropbox is probably not the best choice because anybody can sign up for it. But there are others that you can introduce. Box is one we have our own called Cyber Cloud Storage. ShareFile is another. There are some very legitimate file sharing pieces of software that allow you to share in the cloud. Just make sure that you have control over that and you're not allowing your users to open up an account on Dropbox just randomly and start dropping documents into it. So some quick takeaways for Pillar 5. Avoid uncontrolled file sync services like a Dropbox. I don't mean to pick on Dropbox. It's a good service, but it takes documents out of our control. Include proper file handling and an acceptable use policy. In some instances, we're not, from a technical standpoint, able to block the Dropbox, but if we at least spell it out in an acceptable use policy that a user, an employee has signed, at least we have something to fall back on in case there's a problem. Pillar 6, backup and disaster recovery. We could spend an entire day on this, but I want to just focus on 3 things. Number 1, centralizing data. It just simplifies the backup, the management of the backup. Select the right backup software. There are really 2 types out there now. We'll get into those in a moment. And then make sure you're replicating to a remote location. Just backing up locally and on-premise can create some problems. It's a great start, but let's take that to the next step. So let's start with centralized data. And if we look at this, on the right-hand side, we have the green check mark, which is 3 computers that are sharing data on another, in this case, a server. It doesn't have to be a server. It could be any centralized workstation where we put this. And when we're using 3 computers in this example, it's a little bit easier to manage if we even if we do them separate. But if we get to 5, 10, 15 or more workstations and everybody's saving stuff locally, it becomes much more difficult to manage. So what we prefer is, even if you've got 3 workstations in your environment, pick one to be the central and then share everything off of that and then run the backup off of that central machine. In this case, we've taken it a step further. We've got a server with a file share that has different documents on it. Much easier to manage. So centralize your data is number 1. Number 2 is select the right backup software. There are 2 types, file-based backups and image-based backups. File-based backups look at every single folder and file and back up anything that's changed. Image-based backups only look at the bits, the little ones and zeros that have changed in that image. Let me give you an example. So let's say you have a very large Excel spreadsheet and it has massive calculations, it has just a ton of data on it, and maybe it's a 20 meg Excel spreadsheet. And you go into that spreadsheet and you change one cell, just one number, and you save it. In a file-based backup solution, then when that backup runs again, it will see that that entire file changed, or it'll see that the file itself changed, even though it was one cell, and it'll back that 20 meg up. So it's not very efficient at all. In an image-based backup, when that same scenario comes up and the image-based backup runs again, it only sees the little tiny ones and zeros that have changed, which is a very small amount, and it backs that up to the image backup. And so it's much more efficient. It also means that we can replicate to the cloud faster without having to worry about bandwidth needs. You know, in the past, if you had a massive backup file, you had to try and push that up through the internet connection, which could take some time. With an image-based backup, those changes are very, very small, and we can send those very quickly. We have clients, we're backing up Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. every single hour, and every hour that that backup runs, it takes less than a minute, and to replicate the data up to the cloud takes another 30 seconds, a lot of times less, because it's so efficient. The other thing to note on this slide is that on the left-hand side we have tapes, and if you're still using tape, we need to switch that out. We need to get to something more reliable. Enterprises do use tapes for long-term archiving, but for daily backups, they're just inefficient. They're notorious for failing, and they're very, very slow. Instead, use what we call a NAS device, as the slide shows here. a network attached storage, which is fast. It's really just a big hard drive inside of the enclosure. It's fast, it's reliable, and it works really, really well. The third bullet here is replicate to a remote location. And you can see by this slide, we're backing up to a NAS device, and then we're replicating that up to the cloud. And some of our clients, most of our clients, use a public cloud. So we have a provider in the cloud that simply offers us storage. So we back up our data and we move that up to the cloud, and they maintain it for us. It's fully encrypted. They don't have any access to the keys or anything. We maintain that. All they have is a landing spot for our data. But we have a couple of clients that just do private clouds. So they have a cloud that is their own, under their own control, and then they go ahead and we replicate to that. So replicate to a remote location is key. So now what we end up with is data in 3 locations. On the server, which is in production, on a NAS device or a local backup, and then third, we have it up in the cloud. So we have a very robust protection for our data. So some quick takeaways. Hourly backups, it's surprising to me how many prospects I go into and they're still doing backups once a day, every 24 hours. They just run it at night. That typically indicates they're using a file-based backup because they're not very efficient and they take a long time. If they were using an image-based backup, they could do it much more frequently. And like I said, we do it Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. It helps protect against ransomware. That's one of the key things. So if I get infected at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, I don't have to roll all the way back to the night before's backup. I can just go back to 3 o'clock and be back up and running. That second bullet there, consider bandwidth needs for replication. That's less of a concern these days. Number one, because image-based backups are very, very efficient. There's a very small amount of data being replicated. Second of all, if you've got a Comcast or a Charter or some sort of broadband connection, your speeds are going to be very high and very efficient for sending the data. The third bullet there is test or restore. And even if it's just one file on occasion, once a week, go into your backup, restore a file, just make sure it works. That's a really good indicator that you've got a good backup. If you can restore one file, it's a pretty good indicator. We have clients that take it to the extreme, and in one particular case, we have data that we have their production environment, and they have a co-location in Minneapolis, downtown Minneapolis. And we replicate every hour, we replicate all the data downtown Minneapolis to a disaster recovery site. And once a year, we simulate pulling the plug on production in their office space. And that happens on a Thursday, Wednesday or Thursday. When the users come in the next day, they are working off of the disaster recovery site for the entire day. And then they go home for the night, and then we work on bringing that data back to production so they can get back to work the next day. It's a very involved process, but it works, but it ensures us that if there were ever a disaster, whether the building burned down or whatever it happens to be, that we would be comfortable getting people to work off of that location downtown Minneapolis. Pillar 7, this is a quick one. Don't set it and forget. It's just not an option. You don't have an easy button like you do at Office Max or whatever that is. Make sure that you're monitoring all of these things we're talking about. Also, switching gears just a little bit here, do regular security assessments. We've started doing those in the last couple of years, and it's shocking the amount of holes that are in our clients and our prospects' networks as we get started with them. Also, dark web research. We do scans on the dark web, and anyone that is attending today or watching today, if you just send me an email with your domain name, I can provide for you, free of charge, a list of breaches, or actually that's probably the wrong way to say it, a list of PII that you have on the dark web that's for sale. So my email address will be at the end of this slide, or at the end of this presentation. So in Pillar 7, the takeaways, investing in tools to monitor is likely unrealistic. If you've got a small number of PCs, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe probably under 5, you can probably do this manually. Otherwise, it starts to get a little unwieldy. Like I said, it can be done manually. This is an area where you might want to consider outsourcing. where we've got like Cyber Solutions or groups like Cyber Solutions has the tools that we've invested in the tools to help us automate a fair amount of this and just be alerted when there are problems, and then we can go and remediate very quickly. Pillar 8, authentication methods and password management. We touched on multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication in the past. It's starting to become much more common, especially with banking websites and secure websites. That is having something, knowing something, and then having something. Those two combined make up two-factor authentication. So, very simple example, and I gave it earlier. If I go to my bank and I key in my username and password, that's something I know. But then my bank wants to ensure that it's me, so they'll send a text to my phone and on my smartphone, and then I just retrieve it, key it in, and then I can continue logging in. So then they pretty much verify this must be me unless someone stole my phone and also has my username and password, which certainly is possible, but much more unlikely. So it's the same thing. The same thing can be done for workstations. When I sit down at my tablet and I log in, I have a username and password. But then as soon as I log in, it will reach out and send me a text. It's actually a little app on my phone that says someone's trying to log into your laptop. Do you approve or deny? And obviously if it's me, I click tap approve, and then it lets me in. So it knows that, or it's pretty confident it's me. It has a username and password. I've authenticated and approved through my phone, so they're pretty confident that it is me that's logging in. Password management. You've heard it before, but are you listening? It's comical. Maybe that's the wrong choice of words, but the amount of people that don't use strong passwords. I see password 1 and password 2, or some variant of that. They just keep counting up to come up with passwords, and it's so easy to hack. We have to be looking at strong passwords. And there are the 4 bullets there that list uppercase, lowercase, special characters, numbers. Those are the 4 categories that you should be using in your passwords. If you're using the same password over and over for different sites, if one site gets breached and your password is offered for sale on the dark web, it becomes pretty easy for a hacker to start looking at other sites you visit and using that same password. So you want to make sure they're different. Well, you might say, Dave, that's very difficult to manage all of these passwords. And that's why we can use password management tools. One online version is LastPass, and it's listed up here, lastpass.com. Where you sign up, you have a password vault, and you have one really strong master password, but once you're in, you get all of your passwords of your different sites that you have. You can make them super complex. You don't even ever have to remember the passwords. Once you're into that master vault, you can cut and paste that password to the login site that you want. LastPass is a good cloud-based service. KeePass, the second bullet here, is the one that I use. It is having all of my passwords in the cloud was a little bit unsettling. So I went to KeePass, which is something that's installed locally, and it's something that I have control over. So depending on your comfort level, both of those are good options. There are other options that are starting to come into the field, and I'm imagining this password management piece will start to evolve quite a bit in the next year or so. Some takeaways: if you do have a server, you do have a network, you can create a password policy that basically says, I'm forcing my users to utilize a strong password. They can only utilize, it can't be similar to the previous one. In other words, you can't go password 1 for the starters, and password 2, password 3. You can't do that. It has to be very different. And consider two-factor authentication options and making that, restricting users logging in to making sure they have two-factor authentication, 2 factors of authentication. Employee education and acceptable use policy. Employees are your last line of defense, or your first line, I guess it depends on how you look at it. But they're definitely should be part of your protection strategy. Make sure they understand the risks. Make sure they understand that emails coming in could be infected and what could happen if they click on links that they shouldn't be. You have to sometimes go back a few years to some of the strategies we used to have before email, before instant messaging. Pick up the phone and call, especially when it has to do with financial wires. If there are a lot of those scams going around these days, and they look incredibly legitimate, and a hacker has a lot of different strategies at his disposal to try and get you and convince you that it's a legitimate email to send a wire. That's probably by far one of their most profitable ways of separating you from your money. So maybe putting a new process or procedure in place that says anytime there is a request for a transfer of money via wire electronically, let's pick up the phone. Let's make sure that it's legitimate. Let's not do that interaction via email, because that can be, you don't know who's on the other end. You don't know who's controlling that other end. All right, so employees are your last line. Make sure they understand the risk. Create an acceptable use policy and enforce it. That's a written policy, so it's not technically preventing them from doing these things, but at least we've got something to lean on in case an issue comes up. Some takeaways: create knowledgeable email users. For our clients, what we do, for some of them, we send phishing simulations. So we'll create these legitimate looking emails and send them off, and if people click on them, it becomes a training opportunity. We're not trying to isolate and humiliate people. We just want to see and find those people that might need additional training so they understand the risks involved when they're clicking on email when they shouldn't be. A couple of bullets here: if it looks suspicious, it probably is, delete it. Spelling and grammatical errors or red flags, that's becoming less and less of an issue. They're becoming very good at crafting these emails. Like I mentioned there, hover over links to see unfamiliar web links. Another bullet that I don't have listed here is if you get an email from an ADP or a FedEx, and it is potentially legitimate, where you think, well, yeah, I'm expecting a FedEx package, why is it being delivered? Instead of clicking on that link, open up a browser separate from that and go to FedEx.com manually. You key it in, don't click the link, or maybe you have it as a saved favorite. You can go to it that way and log in. Don't use that link. That is very, very risky. And that leads into my second bullet there: think before you click. They try and prey on your emotions. So if you're not getting a FedEx package, you might be thinking emotionally, well, why am I not getting that? What's wrong? And you might click. Think before you click. And also consider phishing simulation emails. Make sure that your employees aren't just clicking willy-nilly on different emails that come in. Pillar 10, encryption. We want to make sure our data is encrypted. And this is starting to overtake some industries like accounting firms, I'm sure banking. Any data that leaves the office, or maybe even not, should be encrypted. The first bullet I'm talking about here is at rest versus in transit is your backup. So like our backup solution, when we back your data up, it's encrypted at rest, meaning that we back it up, it's sitting on a hard drive somewhere, it's encrypted. It also means in transit, so when we send that up to the cloud and we replicate it, it's encrypted at that level as well. Email encryption, a little bit harder to accomplish. There are, just because of the way certificates, public and encryption certificates work, it's difficult to create an encrypted path from one user to the next, especially when they're outside when they're different organizations. There are utilities out there, or not utilities, but there are services out there that allow you to do that, like a share file. Again, we have our own cyber cloud storage in-house. Then instead of sending an attachment that might be confidential, you send a link to that attachment where the recipient gets that link, goes to it, hopefully they think before they click on that link, and they go to that site, log in, and then they're able to download that content over an encrypted link. The third bullet there, BitLocker. Windows 10 ships with BitLocker, and in a lot of cases it's already enabled depending on where you order it from. But BitLocker is the built-in, for free encryption that's part of Windows 10. You can use it to encrypt the operating system drive. You can also use it to encrypt USB drives, those little memory sticks that you use to transport data back and forth. It's important that you encrypt that data. And then, like I mentioned, that backup encryption needs to be adhered to as well. So some takeaways. Evaluate the data that leaves the network. Mobile data, meaning USB drives or laptops. If those are going to be leaving the network, it's important to get that data encrypted. If that stuff is stolen or lost, we want to make sure that, yeah, it stinks that we lost a piece of hardware, but we want to make sure that data is unlikely to be breached. The backup data should be, that's going to leave the network, so that should be encrypted. And same thing with email attachments. Those three things should be evaluated for how we can best encrypt them. Utilize BitLocker where you can, and utilize backup encryption where you can. Pillar 11 is the wireless networks. First of all, determine need. A lot of people became very in vogue to put a wireless network in the office when no one really even uses it. And I'm definitely not against wireless because there are some very good business reasons for it, but just evaluate whether you really need one. And in the case of, you might also offer a guest network. Some companies like when they have visitors come in, they like guests to be able to utilize the internet via their wireless network. And maybe employees bring their smartphones and in order to allow them to utilize your data instead of their mobile data, you might allow them to connect to a guest network. That's great, we can provide that, but just make sure we're separating the two. So let's determine the need and then determine how that needs to be implemented. If you've got one wireless access point in your network that allows laptops to connect and get to your server, and then guest devices to connect, they're going to be able to get to your server as well. So we want to make sure we separate that stuff. Wireless networks are very easy to attack, especially if they're misconfigured. Think of it, it's been explained to me that if we just took a big Ethernet cable and threw it outside our window and just left it there 24/7, someone could hook up and go. That's exactly what a wireless network is. You know, we're in the building here, across the parking lot is another office space. And our wireless network here is available across the network. Across the parking lot to that side. So someone could be sitting over there right now and knocking on our front door trying to get into our wireless network. Now, we have some pieces in place, we have a firewall in place, so if they were to hack it, they wouldn't have access to any data, but that's basically what we're doing is broadcasting our network in a big net. We don't get to restrict it to just this building. There's just this big, wide broadcast of our network when it comes to wireless, so make sure you need it. Guest versus internal, we talked about that. So some takeaways, no open networks. Don't leave your wireless network open. Even the guest one, we want to assign some password, and if it's it might be a common one that you display in your building so that guests can use it. Make sure you're changing that on a regular basis. Maybe 90 days or 180 days, something along those lines. Utilize the current encryption. Right now, WPA2 with AES is the most secure wireless encryption. TKIP is outdated, still decent, but AES is the most secure at this point. No WEP. WEP is horribly insecure and can be hacked within minutes. Okay, finally, in Pillar 12, cyber insurance. I'm not an insurance person. I'm just going to share some statistics with you, and then you can look at, talk to your insurance agent. Well, you can read through these as well as I can read them, the different data breach costs, and speed of containment is a key. I will tell you this, let's see if I got all the takeaways. Oh yeah, talk to your insurance agent. So, I will tell you this, that through my experience, the cyber insurance rider that's on your current business insurance plan is likely ineffective or inadequate for your needs. So ask your insurance agent if they have a separate cybersecurity policy. Yes, it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's going to give you a lot more coverage, especially if you're dealing with a lot of client data, where if you were to be breached, if you were to get breached, all of that data, you have to notify all of those people, provide them with protection, and that adds up very, very quickly. So make sure that you're talking to your agent about a separate policy that might help in those instances. So. All right, so there is my email address. I'll go ahead and open it up to questions and answers here in a little bit, but my email address is dbell@cybersolutions-web.com. If you got any questions, certainly let me know. So thanks for coming today.
Perfect.